The old gas station stood on the edge of town like a forgotten promise. Its paint was a ghost of what it once was, peeled away by decades of sun and neglect. Inside, Frank Miller, a man of 74 years, turned a wrench, and the sound echoed in the cavernous service bay, a lonely metallic heartbeat. He and his wife, Dorothy, lived here now. They slept in the cramped back office, ate on a makeshift table made from an old tire and a sheet of plywood, and washed from a basin filled with cold water. This was not the retirement they had planned. This was the consequence of a son's betrayal, a quiet theft that had taken everything but their name. Yet, in this place of rust and ruin, they had found something unexpected. They had found a boy named Leo, as lost as they were. They had found a purpose in the grease and grime. And, deep beneath the floor, under the seized hydraulic lift that had refused to budge for 30 years, they had found a secret his father had buried, a legacy of steel and concrete that would become their improbable salvation. They had turned a tomb into a sanctuary. They had built a home from the wreckage of their lives, and in doing so, had drawn the lost and the broken into their light, forging a new family from the pieces of the old. But to understand how they lit the first lamp in that darkness, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the house they lost. It was a small house on a quiet street, the kind of place that held the scent of 50 years of life within its walls. 50 years of marriage. Frank and Dorothy Miller had bought it with the first real money Frank had ever saved, money earned with hands stained permanently with the grease of 1,000 different engines. He was a mechanic. Not just a parts swapper who relied on a diagnostic computer, but a true mechanic, a diagnostician who could understand the language of a sputtering engine, the subtle complaint of a misaligned gear. His hands, though gnarled with age and the first whispers of arthritis, still knew the feel of a perfectly torqued bolt. He had worked at the same garage for 45 years, rising from apprentice to master technician to, for the final decade, the owner. He sold it when he turned 68, handing the keys to a young man who reminded him of himself. Dorothy had been a bookkeeper. For 30 years, she managed the accounts of a local lumber yard, her ledgers a testament to precision and order. Every number in its place, every column balanced to the penny. She saw the world as a system of inputs and outputs, of debits and credits. It was a worldview that had served them well. They lived a modest life, but a stable one. They saved. They invested prudently. They paid off their mortgage 17 years early. They raised their son, Mark, in that house. The walls of the hallway were a gallery of his life, his first steps, his T-ball trophies, his high school graduation, his wedding day. They had poured everything into him. Not just money for college, but their time, their faith, their boundless, unquestioning love. Mark was their pride. He was successful, a financial planner with a sharp suit and a confident smile. He had a wife, Jennifer, and 2 children of his own, their grandchildren, whom they adored. Life was settled. It was predictable. Frank spent his days in his workshop in the garage, restoring a 1965 Ford Mustang, a project he'd been dreaming of his entire life. Dorothy tended her garden, a riot of roses and hydrangeas that was the envy of the neighborhood. They had their routines, their quiet comforts. The creak of the 3rd step on the staircase. The way the afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen window. The shared pot of coffee every morning. It was a life built brick by brick, payment by payment, promise by promise. A solid life. Or so they thought. The idea, when Mark first presented it, sounded like a gift. It sounded like love. "You're rattling around in this big old house," he had said one Sunday dinner, his voice smooth and reasonable. "The upkeep is getting to be too much. The property taxes are insane." Frank had grunted in agreement. The roof would need replacing in a few years. The furnace was older than Mark himself. "Jen and I have been talking," Mark continued, placing his hand over Dorothy's. "We bought the lot next to ours. We want to build you a place. A granny flat. A proper one, not just a room in our house. Your own entrance, your own kitchen. Close enough for us to help, but with all the privacy you want." Dorothy's heart had swelled. To be near the grandchildren every day. To watch them grow up, not just in weekend visits, but in the daily rhythm of life. How could we afford that, Mark? Frank had asked, ever the pragmatist. That's the beauty of it, Mark said, his smile widening. We sell this place. The market is sky high right now. You'll get a fortune for it. More than enough to build the new place outright, and the rest? It goes right into your retirement fund. A nice, big nest egg. No more mortgage, no more property taxes. You'll be set for life. I'll handle all the investments. I'll make it grow. It made sense. It was logical. It was presented as an act of filial devotion, a way to care for them in their old age. Dorothy, the bookkeeper, saw the numbers. They seemed to add up. Frank, the mechanic, saw a future with fewer repairs to worry about. A future where he could focus on his Mustang, maybe build a new, smaller workshop. They trusted him. He was their son. The betrayal was not a single, violent act, but a slow, methodical dismantling of their lives, conducted with a smile. Mark handled everything. He brought the real estate agent. He arranged the photographer. He managed the offers. Just sign here, Dad. Just initial here, Mom. The house sold in a week for a price that stunned them. It was a fortune, more money than they had ever seen in one place. The check went directly into a new investment account that Mark had set up for them. It's safer this way, he had explained. I can get you a much better return. We'll have the construction funds drawn from here as we need them. They moved out of the house on a Tuesday in June. The movers, hired by Mark, were efficient and impersonal. 50 years of life packed into boxes, labeled and stacked in a truck. Dorothy walked through the empty rooms one last time, her hand trailing along the walls. The echoes of laughter and life were already fading, replaced by the hollow sound of her own footsteps. She saw the faint marks on the door frame in the kitchen where they had measured Mark's height year after year. A lump formed in her throat. It's for the best, Frank said, his arm around her shoulder. He was trying to convince himself as much as her. Construction on the new place will take about 2 months, Mark told them, his tone bright and busy. I've booked you a room at a nice extended stay motel. The Sunburst Inn. It's got a kitchenette and everything. It'll be like a little vacation. He drove them there himself. The Sunburst Inn was not what they had pictured. Its sign was flickering, the S in Sunburst dark. The paint was peeling, and the parking lot was a patchwork of cracks and potholes. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and disinfectant. A single window looked out onto a brick wall. It's just temporary, Mark said, setting their suitcases down. He seemed eager to leave. He avoided their eyes. He handed Dorothy an envelope. Here's a couple $1,000 for expenses. For food and things. I'll transfer more in a couple of weeks. He hugged them both quickly, a stiff, awkward gesture. I've got to run. Meeting with the architect. I'll call you tomorrow with an update. He was gone before they could ask a question. He didn't call the next day. Or the day after that. Dorothy called his cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. Hi, you've reached Mark. Leave a message. She left a message. Mark, honey, it's Mom. Just checking in. Call us back. A week passed. The silence from Mark was a living thing, a heavy presence in the small, grim room. Frank tried to be optimistic. He's busy, he'd say. Building a house is a big job. Dorothy, the bookkeeper, felt a cold dread creeping into her columns. The numbers were not adding up. She called Mark's office. He's in a meeting, the receptionist said politely. She called his home. Jennifer, her daughter-in-law, answered. Her voice was strained. Oh, Dorothy. He's just been swamped. I'll have him call you. He never called. The $2,000 was dwindling. Motel rooms, even one like this, were not cheap. Food from the nearby convenience store was expensive. Dorothy started keeping a ledger again, A small notebook where she tracked every dollar. The debits were relentless. There were no credits. After 2 weeks, Frank drove his old pickup truck, the one thing besides their clothes and a few boxes of personal items that hadn't gone into storage, to the lot next to Mark's house. The lot where their new home was supposed to be. It was empty. The grass was uncut. A faded "for sale" sign from a different realtor was hammered into the dirt near the road. There was no architect. There was no construction. There was no granny flat. There was only a lie. Frank came back to the motel room and sat on the edge of the lumpy bed. He didn't speak for a long time. He just looked at his hands, the hands that had built a life that was now gone. He sold it, he said finally, his voice flat. The lot. He never owned it. The truth settled in the room, cold and sharp as broken glass. Dorothy felt a pain in her chest so acute it was physical. It was the pain of a 50-year-old trust being shattered. She pulled out the bank statements Mark had given them for the new investment account. She called the number on the letterhead. A polite voice informed her that the account had been closed. The entire balance had been transferred out 6 weeks ago. The day after the sale of their house had closed. Gone. All of it. The fortune from their home. Their life savings. Their nest egg. Their future. They had been rendered invisible. Discarded. They tried the police. A young, tired-looking officer took their statement in the lobby of the precinct. "Is your son?" he asked, chewing on the end of a pen. "Yes," Dorothy said. "And you gave him the money?" "We trusted him to invest it for us. To build us a home." The officer sighed. "This sounds like a family dispute. A civil matter. You need to hire a lawyer." "A lawyer? With what money?" They had less than $1,000 left to their name. The low point was not a single moment, but a slow, grinding descent. The money ran out. The motel manager, a man with a permanently suspicious expression, knocked on their door. "Checkout was an hour ago," he said, not unkindly, but firmly. They packed their few belongings into Frank's old pickup truck. The boxes that held the remnants of their 50 years of life were in a storage unit, a unit they could no longer afford to pay for. Soon, that would be gone, too. That night, they slept in the cab of the truck in the parking lot of a 24-hour supermarket. Frank, in the driver's seat, stared out at the relentless glare of the fluorescent lights. Dorothy, curled against the passenger door, pretended to be asleep. She felt a shame so profound it was like a physical weight. They had done everything right. They had worked hard. They had saved. They had been good parents, good neighbors, good people. And here they were. Homeless. Invisible. Erased by their own son. The next day, desperation gnawed at them. They had a quarter tank of gas and $37. "What do we do, Frank?" Dorothy asked, her voice a whisper. Frank had no answer. The mechanic who could fix any engine could not fix this. The silence in the truck was the sound of utter defeat. Dorothy closed her eyes, her mind frantically searching for something, anything, any asset they had overlooked, any forgotten corner of their lives that might hold a lifeline. And then, an image surfaced. A memory from long ago. A dusty box in the attic of their old house. A box of her father-in-law's papers. She had packed that box herself. It was in the storage unit. "The storage unit," she said, her voice suddenly urgent. "Frank, we have to go to the storage unit." "Dottie, we can't afford it. They'll have a lock on it. We have $37. The monthly fee is $35. We can pay for this month. Just this 1 month." "What for?" "To look at old pictures." "No," she said, her mind racing. "Your father." "The gas station." Frank stared at her. His father, a stern, quiet man, had owned a small, independent gas station on the far edge of town. It had gone out of business in the early 80s when the new highway bypassed it. It had sat vacant ever since, a relic of a bygone era. He left it to you, Frank. In his will. I remember filing the papers. The deed. It was in that box. Frank shook his head slowly. Dottie, that place is a ruin. It's worthless. The property taxes alone. The taxes were paid, she insisted, the bookkeeper in her suddenly wide awake. Your father set up a trust to pay the property taxes in perpetuity. A tiny one. He didn't want the county to take it. He said a man should always have a piece of ground that is his, no matter what. A piece of ground that is his. The words hung in the air inside the cramped cab of the truck. It was a ruin. It was worthless. It was forgotten. But it was theirs. They drove to the storage facility. The manager was reluctant, but Dorothy's $35, paid in wrinkled bills, was legal tender. He removed the red lock and rolled up the corrugated metal door. The contents of their life sat in a 10 by 10 foot cage. A life reduced to stacked cardboard. Dorothy knew which box she was looking for. It was marked a Miller, G. Papers. Frank hauled it into the light. Inside, beneath yellow tax returns and brittle receipts, was a thick manila envelope. And inside the envelope was a folded, official-looking document. The deed to Lot 4, Block 17, on the old county road. Registered in the name of Franklin Miller. Dorothy held it in her hands. It felt solid. It felt real. It was an anchor in the swirling chaos of their lives. It's a wreck, Dottie, Frank said again, his voice heavy with exhaustion. He saw a derelict building, a symbol of failure. A money pit. Another problem they couldn't solve. Dorothy looked at the deed, then at her husband. She saw the slump in his shoulders, the defeat in his eyes. She had managed ledgers her whole life. She knew that when one column was empty, you had to find a new source of credit. This was not about money. This was about hope. It's still standing, she said, her voice firm. He looked at her, confused. After 40 years of neglect, it's still standing, she repeated. Your father built it. He built it with his own hands. It has good bones, Frank. Just like you. He didn't respond. We have nowhere else to go, she said, her voice softening. Let's just go look at it. That's all I'm asking. Let's just go look. Frank looked at the deed in her hand. He looked at the determination in her eyes. For the first time in weeks, he saw a flicker of the woman he had married, the sharp, steady woman who could find order in any chaos. He took a deep breath. He straightened his shoulders, just a little. All right, Dottie, he said, his voice raspy. Get in the truck. The drive to the old gas station was a journey back in time. They left the manicured suburbs where their son lived, past the strip malls and chain restaurants, and onto the old county highway. The road was cracked and patched, the yellow lines faded to beige. The station appeared suddenly around a bend, half hidden by overgrown trees and tangled vines. It was worse than Frank had remembered. The sign, a rusted metal pole, leaned at a precarious angle, its letters long gone. The windows were boarded over with weathered plywood. The concrete was cracked and spiderwebbed, with weeds pushing through every fissure. The old pump islands were skeletons of rust, their hoses rotted away, their glass faces shattered. It was the picture of decay. Frank pulled the truck to a stop and just stared. I told you, he said quietly. It's a tomb. Dorothy didn't say anything. She got out of the truck and walked towards the building. Her feet crunched on broken glass and loose gravel. She reached the front door to the office and convenience store. It was chained and padlocked. The lock was a single piece of solid rust. Frank got out of the truck and came to stand beside her. He looked at the lock, then went back to the truck and returned with a heavy-duty bolt cutter from his toolbox. He clamped the jaws of the cutter around the chain. He put his weight into it. The muscles in his arms and back, softened by retirement, strained with the effort. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sharp crack that echoed in the silence, the rusted chain snapped. It fell to the ground with a clang. Frank pushed the door. It opened with a long, groaning shriek of protest. They stepped inside. A thick curtain of dust hung in the air, illuminated by the slivers of light forcing their way through the cracks in the boarded windows. The air was thick with the smell of damp, decay, and something else, a faint, ghostly scent of oil and gasoline. Empty shelves lined the walls, coated in a furry layer of grime. The checkout counter was still there, its laminate top peeling. An ancient, disconnected cash register sat on top of it like a metal skull. Behind the counter, a door led to a small back room. It was an office, barely bigger than a closet. A metal desk, a filing cabinet, and a chair were covered in the same thick blanket of dust. On the wall was a calendar from 1983. Miss July smiled out from a field of daisies. This was where they would sleep. Frank walked from the office into the main service bay. It was a large, two-bay garage with a high ceiling. Light filtered down from grimy skylights high above. Pigeons cooed from the rafters, their droppings covering everything. But as Frank's eyes adjusted, he saw it. His father's workbench, exactly where he had left it. A massive thing, built from heavy timbers, with a thick steel plate for a top. A large vise was bolted to one corner. And on the wall behind it, a pegboard. The tools were still there. Wrenches, sockets, pliers, screwdrivers. Each hanging on its own hook, each in its own painted outline. They were coated in grime, with a fine patina of rust, but they were there. Good tools. Snap-on, Mac, Craftsman. Tools meant to last a lifetime. Frank walked over to the pegboard. He reached out and took a 3/4-inch combination wrench from its hook. He wiped the grime off on his pants. The cold, heavy steel felt familiar in his hand. It felt right. He looked around the bay. He saw the collapsed air hoses, the ancient, derelict tire balancer, the junk piled in the corners. He saw the mess. He saw the decay. But for the first time, he also saw a glimmer of something else. He saw work to be done. He took a deep breath, and the smell of old oil filled his lungs. It smelled like home. He turned to Dorothy, who had followed him into the bay. "We'll need a broom," he said. It was the first act of agency. The first step in taking back their lives. Not with lawyers or with anger, but with a broom. They spent the rest of the day cleaning. They swept out the office, creating a small island of relative cleanliness in the sea of filth. Frank found a spigot for an old well pump behind the station. After 20 minutes of wrestling with the handle, rusty water gushed out, then slowly cleared. It was cold and tasted of iron, but it was water. They had water. That night, they slept on the floor of the office, using their coats as pillows. The floor was hard, the air was cold, but they were not in a truck in a parking lot. They were in a place that was theirs. The next morning, Frank started on the service bay. He swept. And swept. And swept. He filled garbage can after garbage can with decades of dirt, pigeon droppings, and debris. As he worked, a plan began to form in his mind. A simple plan. Get the lights on. Get the water running inside. Make one of the bays usable. He started with the electrical panel. It was an old fuse box, not a modern breaker panel. It was a mess of corroded wires and dead insects. He knew he could fix it, but he needed parts. Fuses, wiring, junction boxes. He counted the cash they had left. $2.53. Not enough for a box of fuses, let alone wire. He stood there, staring at the panel, the familiar despair creeping back in. He had the skill. He had the knowledge. He had the tools. But he had no capital. Dorothy, watching him from the doorway, saw the slump return to his shoulders. "What do you need, Frank?" she asked. "Parts," he said, his voice flat. "Money for parts." Dorothy walked over to the boxes of their personal belongings they had retrieved from storage. She opened one marked jewelry, keepsakes. She rummaged inside and pulled out a small, velvet-covered box. Inside, on a bed of faded satin, lay her grandmother's gold locket and chain. It was the only piece of real jewelry she owned. Her only heirloom. She held it out to him. "No, Dottie," he said, shaking his head. "I can't let you do that." "It's just a thing," she said, pressing it into his hand. "Right now, we need fuses more than we need a locket." Her logic was irrefutable. With a heavy heart, Frank drove the truck into the small town nearby, the locket in his pocket. He found a pawn shop. The man behind the counter offered him $60. Frank knew it was worth 5 times that, but he was in no position to bargain. He took the money. Instead of a hardware superstore, he went to a small, old-fashioned place called Hobbs Hardware. The store smelled of sawdust and fertilizer. An older man with a friendly, weathered face stood behind the counter. A name tag on his shirt read, "Earl Hobbs, Prop." "Help you?" Earl asked. Frank laid out his list. Fuses, a roll of 12-gauge wire, wire nuts, electrical tape, a few junction boxes. Earl gathered the items and tallied them up on a notepad. "That'll be $72.40, he said. Frank's heart sank. He only had $60. He looked at the items on the counter, trying to decide what he could do without. He couldn't do without any of it. Earl watched him, his expression shrewd but not unkind. "You the fellow who moved into the old gas station?" he asked. News traveled fast in a small town. "We are," Frank said, a flush of shame rising in his cheeks. "Heard you were fixing it up," Earl said, leaning on the counter. "That place has been an eyesore for 40 years. My dad used to buy his gas from your dad." Frank nodded, not sure what to say. "Your father was a good mechanic," Earl continued. "Fixed my first car. A '57 Chevy. Wouldn't take a dime more than he quoted, even when the job took him twice as long." He looked at Frank's hands, saw the ingrained grease, the calloused knuckles. He recognized the hands of a tradesman. "Look," Earl said, pushing the notepad aside. "Let's call it $60. And you open up an account. Pay me back when you can." Frank stared at him. "Why would you do that?" Earl shrugged. "Professional courtesy," he said. "And because I'd rather see that place fixed up than have it fall down. It's bad for business." It was not charity. It was an investment. It was a vote of confidence. It was the first act of kindness they had received from a stranger in months. "Thank you," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't thank me," Earl said, bagging the parts. "Just get the lights on." Frank drove back to the station with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He had a mission. He spent the rest of the day carefully rewiring the main panel. He worked slowly, methodically, his old skills coming back to him as if they had never been gone. He replaced the corroded wires. He cleaned the contacts. He installed the new fuses. As dusk began to fall, he was ready. Dorothy stood beside him, holding a dusty trouble light he had found, its cord plugged into a single, newly wired socket. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. Frank took a deep breath and threw the main switch. There was a hum, a crackle, and then, light. A single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling of the service bay flickered to life, casting a pool of pale, beautiful light onto the concrete floor. It wasn't much. It was everything. They stood there for a long moment, just looking at it. A single point of light in the vast darkness. Frank laughed. A real, genuine laugh, the first in months. It sounded rusty. The momentum began to build, slowly at first, then with gathering force. With light, they could work past sunset. Frank got one of the bay doors to roll up. He got the old air compressor working, its steady thumping a reassuring rhythm in the quiet. They cleaned. They organized. They carved out a small, functional world from the chaos. One evening, a week after the lights came on, they heard a noise from the other service bay, the one they hadn't touched yet. A furtive rustling sound. Frank grabbed a heavy tire iron. He moved slowly towards the sound, Dorothy a few steps behind him. In the corner, huddled behind a stack of rotted tires, was a figure. A boy. No, a young man, barely out of his teens. He was thin and wiry, with a pale, wary face and dirt-smudged clothes. He looked like a cornered animal. "Get out," Frank said, his voice low and hard. The boy flinched but didn't move. "Please," the boy whispered. "I don't have anywhere to go." The words hit Dorothy like a physical blow. "I don't have anywhere to go." She knew that feeling. She put a hand on Frank's arm. "Wait," she said softly. She stepped forward. "What's your name?" she asked. "Leo," he said, his eyes darting between them. "How long have you been here, Leo?" "A few weeks. Since it got cold. I thought it was abandoned." Frank lowered the tire iron slightly. He saw the kid's worn-out sneakers, the way he shivered even though it wasn't that cold. He saw a reflection of his own desperation. "Are you hungry?" Dorothy asked. Leo nodded, a quick, jerky movement. That night, they shared their meager dinner of canned soup and crackers with him. He ate ravenously, without speaking. He was the first member of their found family. They made a deal. Leo could stay in the second bay. In exchange, he would help them work. The boy was a surprisingly hard worker. He did whatever Frank asked, cleaning, hauling trash, organizing tools. He was quiet and watchful, but slowly, a tentative trust began to form. One day, as they were clearing out the main bay, Leo pointed to the large hydraulic lift set into the floor. "That thing ever work?" he asked. "Not in 40 years, Frank said. Motors probably seized." "Heard a story about it," Leo said, kicking at the edge of the lift. "From one of the other homeless guys. Said the old man who owned this place, your dad, hid something under it." Frank grunted. "Probably old moonshine." "No," Leo said. "The story was, he built something down there." Curiosity piqued, Frank decided to take a look. The control panel was dead, as expected. He and Leo spent a day tracing wires and cleaning contacts. They found the motor, a huge, three-phase electric beast. It was caked in grime. Frank, using his old diagnostic skills, determined that the motor itself was probably fine. The problem was the switching gear. He bypassed the old controls, rigging up a temporary switch directly to the motor's terminals. "Stand back," he warned. He threw the switch. There was a loud groan, a shower of sparks, and then a deep, powerful hum. The motor was alive. Now for the lift itself. The hydraulic pistons were frozen solid with rust and grime. For 3 days, Frank and Leo worked on it. They soaked the pistons in penetrating oil. They used pry bars and sledgehammers. They heated the metal with a torch from Earl's store, an item added to their growing account. Finally, on the 3rd day, with a screech of protesting metal, one of the pistons moved. Just an inch. But it moved. They hooked up the motor again. Frank hit the switch. The motor hummed, the hydraulic pump whined, and slowly, agonizingly, the massive steel platform of the lift began to rise from the floor. It rose a foot. 2 feet. 3 feet. Revealing not a pit of dirt, but a dark, rectangular opening. And a set of steep, concrete stairs leading down into the darkness. Frank grabbed a trouble light and peered down. The air that rose up to meet him was cool and dry, with no hint of damp or mildew. It smelled of concrete and cold steel. "I'll be damned," he breathed. He descended the stairs, Leo and Dorothy following close behind. At the bottom was a heavy, steel-fired door, the kind you might see in a bank vault or a bomb shelter. It was unlocked. Frank pulled it open. They stepped inside and Frank swept the beam of the light around the room. It was not a root cellar or a storage space. It was a workshop. A fully equipped, immaculately preserved, lower-level workshop. It was as if time had stopped in 1983. A heavy-duty lathe stood against one wall, coated in a thin layer of Cosmoline. A drill press. A milling machine. A massive cast-iron table saw. There were cabinets filled with precision measuring tools, micrometers, calipers, all in velvet-lined cases. There was a welding station with full tanks of oxygen and acetylene. On a workbench, a set of blueprints was laid out, held down by a coffee mug. Frank picked it up. The coffee inside had long ago turned to a black, solid disc. His father had been building a bomb shelter. A product of the Cold War paranoia of the early 80s. He had never finished it. But he had built the workshop to build it. And it was perfect. It was a time capsule of craftsmanship. This was the secret under the lift bay. Not treasure. Something infinitely more valuable. It was a means of production. A way to build, to create, to earn. A new ecosystem began to form, organically. With the equipment in the downstairs workshop, Frank could do more than just basic auto repair. He could machine parts. He could weld. He started by fixing an old lawnmower for a neighbor who had stopped by out of curiosity. The neighbor paid him $20. It was the first money they had earned in months. Word spread. People started bringing him things. Broken farm equipment. A cracked engine block from a tractor. A bicycle frame that needed welding. Not charity exactly, more like an exchange. They paid what they could. Sometimes in cash. Sometimes in vegetables from their garden, or a dozen eggs, or a freshly baked pie. Dorothy kept the books, her ledger now showing a slow but steady stream of credits. They paid off their account at Earl's store. They bought a small refrigerator and a hot plate. One afternoon, a battered car pulled into the station. A young woman got out. She was pregnant, her belly swelling under a thin, worn-out dress. She had a black eye. I heard you help people," she said, her voice trembling. Her name was Maria. She was fleeing an abusive boyfriend. She had $50 and a tank of gas. She had nowhere to go. Dorothy looked at her, at the fear and the hope warring in her young eyes. She remembered sleeping in the truck. She remembered the feeling of having nowhere to go. "The back room is small," Dorothy said. "But the roof doesn't leak." Maria became the second member of their found family. She was quiet and scared at first, but she was a worker. She helped Dorothy clean and organize the old convenience store space, scrubbing shelves, washing windows. She had a knack for organizing, and soon the front room started to look less like a derelict shop and more like a tidy, if Spartan, reception area. The small community was a fragile, self-sustaining system. Frank and Leah worked in the bays, their days filled with the sounds of tools and engines. Dorothy and Maria managed the front, handling the customers, keeping the books, and creating a space that felt safe and orderly. They were all broken in their own ways. They were all discarded. But here, in this forgotten gas station, they were building something together. They were no longer invisible. Of course, it couldn't last. Anything that grows attracts attention. The threat, when it came, arrived in a pristine white county vehicle. A woman in a crisp uniform, with a clipboard and an air of weary authority, stepped out. She was from the Code Enforcement Department. She walked around the property, making notes. She noted the UN-permitted electrical work. The UN-permitted plumbing for the well pump. The commercial property being used as a residence. The UN-licensed auto repair business. The zoning violations were a litany of bureaucratic sins. She taped a bright orange notice to the front door. A condemnation order. It stated, in cold, official language, that the property was deemed unsafe and unfit for human habitation. They had 30 days to bring the entire property up to current county code, or vacate the premises. Failure to comply would result in fines and forcible removal. The piece of paper felt heavier than a tombstone. It was the system, impersonal and implacable, coming to sweep them away. The progress they had made, the fragile sanctuary they had built, it all seemed about to crumble. DISPA, the old, familiar enemy, settled over the station like a shroud. Frank saw an insurmountable mountain of permits, inspections, and regulations. Leo saw another eviction, another return to the streets. Maria, her hand resting on her pregnant belly, saw a return to the fear she had just escaped. But Dorothy, the bookkeeper, saw something else. She saw a list of problems to be solved. A ledger to be balanced. 30 days, she said, pulling the notice from the door. That's a deadline. That's not a final judgment. But even she didn't know where they would start. The community, their small, fragile community, was the first to rally. Earl Hobbs heard the news the next day. He showed up at the station in his pickup truck. Saw the love letter from the county, he said, nodding at the orange sticker. Figured you might need a hand. He wasn't alone. With him was a man named Gus, a retired master electrician with a perpetually grumpy expression, and a man named Sal, a retired plumber who seemed to find everything amusing. They were old friends of Earl's, part of the town's informal network of retired tradesmen. Albright's a stickler, Gus said, referring to the code inspector. But she's fair. If the work is good, she'll pass it. The question is, can you do good work? He looked at Frank. Frank led them downstairs to the hidden workshop. Gus and Sal walked through the space, their eyes taking in the pristine equipment, the orderly layout. Gus ran a hand over the heavy-duty lathe. Holy smokes, he muttered. Sal whistled. Your dad built this? He did, Frank said. The two old tradesmen looked at each other. They recognized the work of a master. And in that, they recognized Frank as one of their own. All right, Gus said, his gruffness softening slightly. Let's see that electrical panel. They became the project foreman. Gus drew up a plan to bring the entire station's wiring up to code, far beyond what Frank had done. Sal designed a proper plumbing system, not just for the well, but for a real bathroom with a shower and a hot water heater. They didn't do the work for Frank. They guided him, and Leo, teaching them, supervising them. No, bend the conduit like this, you'll get a smoother pull. Solder that joint again. I want to see it shine. Earl provided the materials at cost, his account book filling up once more. Maria, her organizational skills now fully awakened, took on the mountain of paperwork. She spent hours at the town library, researching county codes, printing out permit applications, and creating a binder for Dorothy that was as meticulous as any of her old ledgers. They worked from sunrise to sunset. The station was a hive of activity. The sound of saws and hammers replaced the quiet hum of the compressor. They were not just fixing a building. They were building a case. Proof that they belonged there. It was in the middle of this frantic, hopeful period of construction that the ghost from their past reappeared. A sleek, expensive sedan, a car that cost more than the entire gas station was worth, pulled up one afternoon. Mark got out. He wore a tailored suit and an expression of profound distaste as he looked at the mess of construction. He had heard a rumor. A twisted, funhouse mirror version of the truth. That his parents had found oil on the old property, that they had struck it rich. He hadn't come to apologize. He had come to collect. He saw Frank, covered in sawdust, and Leo, his hands black with grease. He saw Maria, heavily pregnant, sweeping the porch. He saw the collection of old men, Gus and Sal, arguing over a blueprint. What is all this? He asked, his voice dripping with condescension. What have you done to Grandpa's property? Frank said nothing. He just looked at his son, this stranger in a fancy suit. Dorothy came out of the office, holding her paperwork binder. She stood in front of Mark, her posture erect, her gaze steady. Hello, Mark, she said, her voice devoid of warmth. Mom, he said, forcing a smile. I was so worried. I heard you'd fallen on hard times. And then I heard this incredible news. That you'd found something here. I came as soon as I could. We found a place to live, Dorothy said. After you left us at the motel. The smile on Mark's face faltered. That was a misunderstanding, he said quickly. A temporary setback in the investment strategy. I was going to call you. You were going to call us, Dorothy repeated, her voice flat. It was not a question. She opened her binder. The house sold for $752,000, she said, her voice as clear and precise as a bank statement. The money was transferred from the escrow account to your investment account, number 74B, 291. The next day, that entire amount was moved to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. An account for which we were not signatories. Was that also part of the investment strategy, Mark? Mark's face went pale. How did you? That's confidential client information. I'm a bookkeeper, Dorothy said simply. I know how to follow the money. She looked past him, at the little community working together. These people, she said, her voice gaining a quiet strength, they are our family now. They took us in when our own son left us to sleep in a truck. Mark looked at Leo and Maria with disgust. This is who you surround yourself with? A homeless delinquent and a pregnant teenager? This is pathetic. This, Dorothy said, her voice like ice, is honest. It is something you would not understand. The confrontation was a turning point. A moment of absolute clarity. What would you do in this position? What would you say to a son who had betrayed you so completely? Let me know in the comments below. And if you've made it this far, and you believe in second chances and the power of community, hit that subscribe button. It means the world to us. Mark stared at his mother, seeing not a victim, but a judge. He tried one last time. I'm still your son, he said, his voice pleading. I can help you. We can sell this place, get you a proper apartment. You are no son of mine, Frank said, speaking for the first time. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a final judgment. This is our home. Now get off our property. Mark stood there for a moment, his mask of charm completely gone, revealing the hollow, selfish man beneath. He got back in his expensive car and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. No one watched him go. They all had work to do. The 30 days passed in a blur of frantic labor. They finished on the 29th day. The wiring was new. The plumbing was new. They had a real bathroom with a working shower. The old office was now a clean, bright living space with 2 small, partitioned bedrooms. The convenience store area was a clean, welcoming reception and community room. One of the service bays was a fully functional, licensed, and insured repair shop. The other was a clean, dry storage area. The downstairs workshop was their hidden ace. On the 30th day, the white county vehicle returned. Ms. Albright stepped out, her expression as stern and unreadable as before. She held her clipboard like a weapon. This was the final test. Frank, Dorothy, and their small family stood waiting as she began her inspection. She started with the exterior. She noted the new paint, the clean windows, the weeds removed from the cracks in the concrete. She walked inside. She spent a long time in the bathroom, turning the taps on and off, flushing the toilet. She checked the hot water heater installation, comparing it to the permit Sal had filed. She moved to the electrical panel. Gus stood beside her, his arms crossed, saying nothing. She opened the panel door. Inside, the wiring was a work of art. Every wire was perfectly straight, every connection tight, every label clear and precise. It was far beyond code. It was craftsmanship. Ms. Albright ran a finger over one of the conduits. She looked at Gus, who just grunted. She went through the entire building, checking every outlet, every switch, every plumbing fixture. She examined the business license hanging on the wall of the reception area. She reviewed the binder of permits and plans that Maria handed her. The entire inspection took over an hour. The whole time, she said nothing, her face giving away no hint of her thoughts. Finally, she stood in the middle of the main room, looking around at the transformed space. She looked at Frank and Dorothy. She looked at Leo, who stood nervously by the door to the shop. She looked at Maria, who was setting out a pot of coffee. Her gaze lingered on the bulletin board where customers had pinned thank you notes for Frank's work. "You've been busy," she said. It was the first thing she had said the entire time. Yes, Dorothy said. Ms. Albright tapped her clipboard with her pen. The code requires a GFCI outlet within 6 feet of a water source. Your plumber put one every 4 feet. Gus is thorough, Frank said. The electrical panel is wired to a standard I haven't seen outside of a hospital, she continued. She looked at the small living quarters. Zoning for this lot is mixed commercial, light industrial. Residential use is prohibited. A cold dread filled the room. After all this work, were they going to be defeated by a single line in a zoning book? However, Ms. Albright continued, flipping a page on her clipboard, there is a variance for a live-in caretaker or proprietor of a business. Given that you are operating a licensed business on the premises, you qualify for that variance. She clicked her pen. She made a series of check marks on her form. Then, she signed the bottom with a flourish. She tore off a copy and handed it to Dorothy. It was a certificate of occupancy. This isn't a gas station anymore, Mr. Miller, she said, a flicker of something like a smile touching her lips. According to the county, this is now a legal residence and place of business. Congratulations. She turned to leave. At the door, she paused. My brother has an old John Deere tractor that hasn't run in years, she said, not looking at them. I'll tell him to bring it by. And then she was gone. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Sal the plumber let out a whoop. Leo grinned, a wide, unrestrained smile that transformed his face. Maria hugged Dorothy. Frank stood there, looking at the certificate in Dorothy's hand. Vindication. It didn't feel like a triumphant victory. It felt like peace. Like the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. The aftermath came in waves. A young reporter from the local weekly paper, tipped off by Earl Hobbs, came to do a story. He had been planning a small human interest piece about an old gas station being fixed up. But when he heard the whole story, the betrayal by their son, the homelessness, the community they had built, he knew he had something much bigger. The story ran on the front page. The station of second chances. It told of Frank's skill, Dorothy's resilience, and the family they had forged from strangers. It didn't name Mark directly. It simply referred to a son who worked in finance. But in a town this size, everyone knew. The article brought shame. Not on Frank and Dorothy, but on Mark. His clients, many of them elderly themselves, began to ask questions. An anonymous tip, sent by a guilt-ridden Jennifer who had finally left him, was made to the State Financial Regulatory Board. An investigation was launched. The offshore accounts were discovered. Mark's life of carefully constructed lies unraveled. Frank and Dorothy learned of it not with glee, but with a quiet, somber sense of justice. His downfall was not their victory. Their victory was the life they were building. The gas station, now known to everyone as simply the station, became a true community hub. The news story brought more people. Not just customers, but volunteers. A local gardening club came one Saturday and helped them build raised beds in the cracked concrete out front. They filled them with good soil and planted vegetables and flowers. A garden grew where there had only been decay. It symbolized the new life they were cultivating. Maria gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Hope. The entire station became the baby's extended family. Gus built her a beautiful wooden cradle. Sal fixed up an old high chair. Leo, who had been so quiet and withdrawn, discovered a knack for making the baby laugh. He decided he wanted to go to community college to get his mechanic's certificate. Frank became his mentor, teaching him not just how to fix engines, but the pride of doing a job right. The new normal settled into a peaceful, productive rhythm. The days were filled with work and the quiet hum of life. The evenings were for shared meals in the community room, the air filled with the smell of Maria's cooking and the sound of laughter. One day, a letter arrived. It was from Frank's niece, the daughter of his estranged sister. She was a lawyer, an assistant district attorney in a city a few hours away. She had seen the article online. The letter was full of shame and regret. Shame for what Mark had done. Regret that her family had lost touch, that they hadn't been there for Frank and Dorothy. She didn't make excuses for Mark. She just apologized for her own absence. She wanted to visit. Dorothy read the letter to Frank. "What do you think?" she asked. Frank was silent for a long time, looking out at the garden where Maria was showing baby Hope the blooming tomatoes. "The door's open," he said finally. It wasn't absolution. It was a beginning. A chance to rebuild a different kind of bridge, one built on honesty instead of lies. The new reality was better than the old one. Their old life had been comfortable but insular. This new life was messy, vibrant, and deeply connected to the people around them. They had lost a house, but they had gained a home. They had lost a son, but they had gained a family. One evening, as a warm summer dusk settled over the valley, Frank and Dorothy sat on a bench that he and Leo had built. It was placed near the old, rusted signpost, the one relic of the original station they had decided to keep. From their vantage point, they could see the whole of their small kingdom. The warm light spilling from the windows of the community room. The neat rows of the garden. Leo, under the lights of the service bay, showing a younger kid from town how to change the oil on his first car. Maria, on a blanket on the grass, rocking Hope to sleep. Frank looked at Dorothy. The lines on her face were deeper than they had been a year ago, but her eyes were clear and bright. She was not the frightened, defeated woman from the motel room. She was the architect of this new world. His hand found hers, the familiar touch, a silent conversation that spanned 50 years. He followed her gaze to a single, bare bulb they had installed on top of the old signpost. It was an echo of the first light he had turned on, a beacon against the falling night. It wasn't just a light. It was a promise that even in the deepest darkness, a single, determined spark could build a world. The light stayed on all night, every night.